We're still in AP Lit, and this is like part 2 of AP Lit discussion, and why don't we go here, Kieran?
So I'm kind of the opposite of Liam. I really didn't like this section because it felt like it was too different from the rest of the book, because in the beginning of the book, like, most things that could have gone wrong did go wrong, and then in this one, it was just kind of like, oh, Huck like runs into this family, they just happen to think he's Tom Sawyer, and that's really good for him, and then Tom just happens to come along, and then they happen to get rid of the king of the Duke, and Jim just happens to get free, so they don't actually have to rescue him. It was
Does
just
it seem contrived to you in a way that the other part of the book seemed more natural?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a legitimate comment.
Well, personally, I like the second half, or the last 15 chapters of the book, because you really get to see how Huck matures into someone who's isn't basing his beliefs off of things he's heard, he's basing them off of his experiences. And I really like the part where Tom says his plan, because it shows that Huck is more mature than Tom, because Tom is basing all of his things off of things he's read and things that he hasn't actually really experienced. It's just his child dreams, and Huck is more practical. And I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting, and I did like the part where he was like, maybe I also should cut Jim's leg off for extra pizzazz. It was just really funny.
I'd forgotten that. It reminded me of Huck earlier, who didn't mind, wanted to kill little Tommy Baines for squealing on him. Even Huck, I mean, Tom, that's not reasonable. You and I noticed that, yes.
I liked how the last 15 or so chapters was kind of alluding back to the beginning of the book. Because at the beginning of the book, you have all the boys meeting the little hideout, talking about the plans of going on this great adventure. And with Tom meeting and all of this, them making all this stuff. If you tell him that's gonna kill you and kill your family, and then you just have Tom back at the end of the book, and you're like, oh, we should, like Sarah said, saw him his leg just for some pizzazz, and then we'll put some rats and stuff in him, make him with blood and draw on walls. Just because it's fun, and I read about all these things. And then you just have Tom and Jim at the very end just going back on another adventure, but without having Tom. I don't know.
I think Clay said something last period about it. What you're just saying reminds me of the fact that the book starts and ends similarly, right? You even said that we're back to the beginning again, except things are different too. And it's just interesting to compare remember one of the questions on the data sheets, remember the data sheets we did for Great Expectations and Private Prayer? I thought one of the best questions was, describe the opening scene and the closing scene. Well, in this case, it would be the opening scenes and the closing scenes frame this novel really well. So I'm just sharing you the criticism. Some of us like the end, some don't. But you have to acknowledge the artistry of it, that, wow, that's brilliant to end the book and begin and end the book. And notice in both cases, they're not on the river. The book begins on land and ends on land. But the part that we like, or the part that seems to be fulfilling, is the sea part, or the river part. I don't know, that structure I think is important. Yeah.
Other people kind of said this, but I just thought it was interesting how at the beginning of the book, Huck was a lot like Tom, and then he's grown up since then, and then he was just trying to get Jim out and get him safe, but then Tom came and was trying to do all this extra stuff and so Tom hasn't changed, but Huck changed a lot.
Yeah, why does Huck give them? Somebody brought that up last year. Why does Huck give in to Tom again? Look what Huck's been through. You'd think he faced all these terrible situations, Grangerford, Jefferson's, King of the Duke, but there he goes again. He acquiesces to Tom. What does that say about Huck? It's the old Huck, right? That's what he did at the beginning, but
He's always just gone along with what Tom does and not really been himself.
yeah, we'll come back to that. Yes.
This is kind of in agreement with what Kieran said about the ending of the book, but I just didn't like specifically the King and the Duke, the way that was over, because I just thought it was so annoying how they kept coming back, in more of the middle of the book, and how they could never get rid of them, and then at the end, they were just kind of suddenly gone, and it was it felt like it was just all this stuff leading up to it, and then they were just gone, and I just wish it would have happened a lot sooner.
You know, I didn't mind the King and the Duke earlier, they annoyed me too, I always showed back up. You know, Huck and Jim think they're out, you know, out of their way, and there they are, they're on the raft. But it's really, I think somebody might comment on the way Huck, well, how do they meet their demise? What does that say, and how does Huck respond to it? There was still something Kinsley I wanted to break, so keep that in mind, let's see what he
Yeah,
likes.
like, one of the things I really don't like about the, like, last section of the book is sort of what Kinsley was saying about, like, Huck sort of regressed once Tom came back, right? Because he spent, like, the whole time down the river growing as a person. And then as soon as Tom comes back, he sort of gives in and goes back to being an impulsive, like, child who thinks the life of a slave is worth, you know, a little bit of fun, right? Because instead of actually getting him out, they try to bake a pie with a ladder inside of it and do that for basically no reason. And then, like, it just seems like the whole time leading up to this, the message was sort of like, these convoluted plots don't really work, because with the King and the Duke, every city they would go and they would try to do some scheme to make money, and generally it wouldn't work, or they would lose the money somehow. And then at the very end, the King and the Duke leave to go wherever, and it's just Huck and Tom, and they do one of these convoluted plots, and it like works. So it just seems kind of off base from the rest of the novel.
To me, what makes the plot, I don't know what the word believable, anyway, if you could, if the plot is not, if their actions are not motivated by something, to me, I have a problem. So that's when you were talking about, can't remember all the details you were saying, but if there's sufficient motivation for the character to do it, then it's, remember, verisimilitude, didn't we talk about that? Isn't that the word we put up Friday? Without it, then you tend not to believe it. But did Huck and in any of his decisions, the King and the Duke, was there sufficient believable motivation? For instance, they lost everything because of their greed. That actually makes sense to me. That's believable. Yes, Courtney.
I'm just gonna say, kind of going off of what you guys said, I think for part of his interaction with Tom Sawyer, it was like a little disappointing to me because I thought there would be a little more character growth there. Because you could so clearly see that Tom hadn't changed, but Huck had. I was hoping for more of that type of stuff to happen, but I did think it was a little bit, I don't know if this is like different from how he was before, but it showed a little bit of how his, how he's so practical. When he was with Tom, he kept making allowances for everything Tom wanted to do, but like when Tom said, oh, let's just pretend that we're digging with knives, and let's just pretend it took 37 years, like, and Huck said, or Huck would be like, well, I guess it doesn't hurt to pretend, so we might as well just do that.
And it's funny that they're pretending
Yeah.
already, but we're gonna have to pretend about the 30 years, because that's what, I thought that was funny, you reminded me of it. It's the kind of thing, getting Jim out of this captivity is something you could pass on to your children and your grandchildren. It's like, this is what we do. My children will grow up and they will try to get him free. Of course, that's nonsense, but it's funny because it's so absurd, yeah.
I feel like Tom is like the epitome of like what you want in adventure. He has these ideals of going on this great adventure and being like super, I don't know how to explain it, like big and I don't know, outrageous, that's the word. But then Huck actually experienced like an actual adventure and expectation versus reality. So I just like the comparison.
And I think it's fortunate that Tom's the one who got his leg shot, because he needed a little dose of his own medicine, because like you said.
It's like, there's your adventure, Tom. I got shot in the leg.
Yeah, and he's proud of it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the thing, he even turns that. Maggie, anything, I got a couple more things, but anything you wanna add?
Yeah, I was just like, even though Huck kind of went back to how he was before Tom, he kind of like pointed out how Tom was, like how he's like how he managed to get out of all the work and just bossing around. And then also the thing about him getting shot in the leg, Huck kind of turned that into this thing that what Courtney said about
Yes. And it's come up several times. Would anybody like to explain how the King and the Duke exit the story? Because that was, yes,
Weren't they being like tarred and feathered?
they were. And so that makes sense, because remember, they left those people in Pikeville hanging, because they wanted to throw stuff at them. And they never could, so they just kept following them down the road. It wasn't hard to do. These people been here, you see these people, they finally caught up with them. Can I read that to you? Two things out, here it is. I don't know, I'll tell you, this would be easy for you to find. It's the third paragraph to the end, if you want to mark it, of chapter 33. So chapter 33, it's right before you get to 34, third paragraph. The paragraph begins with, "On the road, Tom told me all about how it was reckless. It was reckoned I was murdered." And I don't want to read that, we don't have time, but I want to go down about a third or quarter of the way. Well, let me start. "And I told Tom all about," you see that? "And I told Tom all about our royal nonesuch rapscallions, and as much of the raft voyage as I had time to. And as we struck into the town and up through the middle of it, it was as much as half after 8 then. Here comes a raging rush of people with torches and an awful whooping and yelling and banging the tin pans and blowing horns. We jumped to one side to let them go by." Does it sound like they had a lot of fun banging? What's the yelling and whooping, banging tin blowing horns? That sounds like a 4th of July parade. "And as they went by, I see they had the king and the duke astraddle a rail." Just use your imagination for that. If you can't picture that, it would be a very uncomfortable way to leave town. "That is, I knowed it was the king and the duke, though they was all over tar and feathers." And notice this, "And they didn't look nothing in the world that was human. Just looked like a couple of monstrous big soldier plumes. Well, it made me sick to see it, and I was sorry for them, poor pitiful rascals. It seemed like I could never feel any hardness against them any more in the world. It was a dreadful thing to see. Human beings can be awful cruel to one another." And of course, the book's almost over, but he never mentions the Duke and the King after that. Just like Buck. Buck dies, he mourns briefly, he never mentions him again. Mary Jane, he was in love with Mary Jane maybe, never mentions her again. Shows you his realistic attitude. What is that? Tar and feathering, and what I'm trying to say, they're not lynching. We think of lynching as hanging, but that mob action against him, it's so succinctly put. What is Mark Twain satirizing? Criticizing. Well, that was a common practice, tar and feathering, and it's inhuman. I mean, it burned their skin. You probably heard stories about that. And probably many could die from it and it'd never be the same. Now, did they deserve that? I don't like them too much either, but did they deserve that? Is it a capital offense to con people out of money? They didn't put a gun to anybody's head at any point. They just outsmarted them, and of course they ended up losing, but that wasn't the point. They took these people's money. I don't believe that's a capital offense, and this is more than capital. This is torture, which is forbidden by the Constitution. So, and look at Huck. If anybody was conned, it was Huck, and stiff-armed by these people. But he couldn't feel sorry for them. And my estimation of Huck is, higher at this point. This is before all the events that happened with Tom, with Jim, but it's pitiful. Human beings can be awful cruel to one another. That is a picture of cruelty. And what's on my mind, and it's going to lose the effect. If I were really on the ball at this moment, I would reach behind my back and pull out this Life magazine from the 1960s, because it's sitting in my car right now, and it's doing nobody any good. But on the front cover, is a picture of Mark Twain and a title. The first time this particular work by Mark Twain was published was in This Life magazine. And it's a fragment, the first 4 or 5 chapters of a novel called, I think it's called Among the Indians. And you got Tom and Huck together again. I read it. And believe me, it is not funny. I mean, he has that satire, but they go out with a crew into the wilderness, and it's criticized because of his view of American Indians. He makes them look awful, the way they treat people and what they do to people, in their warfare. It's really dark. But somebody pointed out last period that he said he wanted to go out west. Remember how books ends? He wants to go out west. Well, Mark Twain is faithful to that idea and then takes him out west. He and Tom again. I couldn't stop reading it, but it was not fun. And it was really, you think, this is dark compared to Tom Sawyer. That is even darker. And remember I told you that's how he ended his life, kind of a very cynical person. So just notice he feels pity for them, but he gets over it. He's practical. I'll show you one more thing. It is actually 2 or 3 pages back of that. Let me make sure I got that now. It's right before you get to the end of chapter 32. One more statement that I've got to point out to you. And I always appreciate people who come up with events, incidents that nobody else comes up with. Remember that? If you can use the more obscure things you got to do justice to the major ideas, but if you can find some maybe less popular examples, I always think that helps, because everybody's going to read your paper in the AP. They've read Huck Finn 1,000 times. And showing that you know something else about the book that maybe a lot of people miss is a good thing. So do you see where I am? I will read it. Why, Silas, look yonder, up the road, ain't that somebody coming? Do you see that? It's just about 3 or 4 paragraphs. Anybody know the page number of that?
202.
Thank you. Would you turn there? I just want you to see it and suggest that you bracket it, star it, mark it, underline. It's really short. That is not the one I want. I'm so sorry. It's the previous page, so you got to go back. I'm sorry. I had marked that, but it's back about 5 or 6 paragraphs where it says, it weren't the grounding. You see that? It's a little dialogue between him and Aunt Sally. All right. It's real short, but he's trying to figure out an alibi stuff, because Uncle Silas is smart, and he says, you said you came down the river, up the river. He doesn't quite believe Huck's story that he is, which happens shortly after this, Tom Sawyer. And so he's trying to make an excuse for why he came the way he did. And the excuse is that they had trouble with the steamboat. This is what he says. It weren't the grounding. That's not what caused the delay, the grounding of the boat. That didn't keep us back but a little. We blowed out a cylinder head, so an explosion in the engine room. And she says, good gracious, anybody hurt? And he says, no, nobody's hurt, no. Killed, and he uses the N-word, killed a slave. And she says, well, it's lucky, because sometimes people do get hurt. Now you see the incredibly succinct comment on racism right there? Because he's black, and you mentioned it earlier about he's white inside, in that, Courtney mentioned that. It's a similar comment, maybe worse. Because slaves aren't human beings, they can't get hurt, or their death doesn't matter. And of course what she says, it's lucky because sometimes people, i.e. white people, do get hurt. And to me, that is just, at least slavery and racism at this time period, 1850s, that people had to imagine that the other race was subhuman, because you couldn't treat somebody that way if you thought they were fully human. Anyway, I just wanted you to see that, and I think everybody had, let me point out these two things, I'll give you this sheet. What is being satirized with the evasion, and that's what Tom calls it, that's the escape or the rescue of Jim. What is being satirized? What's he making fun of? These ridiculous, absurd things that they have to do on Tom's part to rescue him.
Is he contrasting Huck's realism with Tom's idealism?
Yes, and where does Tom get his idealism, just like he did at the beginning of the book?
Just from books and like stuff he's heard.
Right, and you do it because that's the way it's done. And do you think maybe some people during the time of slavery said that too? It's just what it is. We just do it. That's what we do. We don't know why we do it, but that's just what we do. It's that non-thinking attitude. The king and going acquiescing to Tom. Just share this. Why did he do it? We talked about it earlier. Remember, he's the kind of guy that would always acquiesce to people that were more powerful, and in Tom's case, more charismatic. You just don't want to cause problems. So Huck always retreats back into that. Okay, Tom's here. It's just, I don't want to cause problems. Let's let him do it his way, even though he didn't like it. And I think that does show he's changed some. He doesn't like it, but he's putting up with it because that's how he lives his world. So I have time. What I want you to do is nothing else to do. You haven't got anything else to do. And this is it right here. It's the only thing you have to do in the next 2 days. I know that's not true. If you don't have anything for me, I'd like you to answer these, not in writing paper or anything. I'm talking in bullet points. I just need to see a fair effort on your part of jotting down ideas that come to mind. And your paper on Thursday will probably come from this list, either in part or whole, or combination thereof. I'm going to read through them quickly. And again, what I want to see is for just a homework assignment is just some notes you could take on these. First one is about sentimentality. So you need to make sure you understand it, define it, and give examples, list examples, you bullet point them, of people and events that are meant to show his attitude toward sentimentality. Secondly, the violence. We wrote a paper on House of Seven Gables about a violent event that shaped the meaning of the book. So think about all of them. We just mentioned several just today. There's the relationship between violence. What is that relationship between violence and sentimentality? There can be a lot of things that start violence, but we're looking at one thing that might start it, that's sentimentality. And why are Jim and Huck not violent people? And I alluded to part of it. They're willing to give in, for one thing. They don't fight back. 3, relationship with Jim and Huck. What roles does Jim play in Huck's life? How does Huck grow in his understanding, acceptance of him? Give example. I think about the tricks that Huck plays on Jim, and the evolution of his attitude about them. That's one way to approach it. That would be 3 or 4 of those moments. And then his attitude toward the escape, or what am I saying? The helping Jim escape. You know, those somebody mentioned it. The moral crisis he goes through every time he thinks he's trying to help him. 4, this is probably the least maybe significant, I don't know. You could make it into, that is the river. What is, river is almost like a character in the book. It's definitely a symbol. It's what makes the plot work. So identify and explain symbolic meanings of the river and what role the river plays. I think you could probably do a really good job if I asked something like that. Might give you options and choices, but how does the river help the meaning of the work as a whole? And finally, just Huck's growth, not just in relationship to Jim, and several of you mentioned that he seems to have grown, not fully, because, and that'd be important here. He's still acting like, you know, subservient to Tom, but how does how does he change and what areas does he change? So it kind of like number 3, but it's broader than number 3. So I'd like for some answers, just bullet points, thinking through it. We'll discuss it on Wednesday and write about it on Thursday. And Friday, I'm going to introduce the next book. So Lord willing, we'll be here for all that. But please always take stuff with you. For some reason, if you can't, we couldn't get back in the building for any reason, always just make sure you've got it.